The December wind tore through the city like an animal with teeth, turning what had been gentle snowfall into a blizzard that stung exposed skin. Jerome Morgan walked through Riverside Park with his head down, his charcoal wool overcoat doing little against the cold that seemed to find every gap in the fabric. His mind was still replaying the quarterly earnings call that had stretched past midnight, parsing every analyst's question for hidden skepticism. At 42, he had transformed Morgan Technologies from an ambitious idea into a force that shaped markets. But empire building extracted its tribute. His daughter lived 3 states away with his ex-wife. Their weekly video calls a poor substitute for the bedtime stories and scraped knees he'd once been part of. His penthouse overlooking the river was a showcase of architectural achievement and a tomb of silence. His calendar overflowed with obligations while his heart had learned to operate on minimal power, like a server in sleep mode. He was cutting through the park because his usual car service had been delayed by the storm, and Jerome had grown impatient waiting in the Morgan Tech lobby. Better to walk the 12 blocks than stand still, watching security guards wish him good night with the careful politeness reserved for men who sign their paychecks. The Christmas lights woven through the park's skeletal trees glowed against the white dark sky, their cheerfulness and accusation. The holidays had become something to survive rather than celebrate. Another quarter on the calendar where he measured time in revenue growth instead of moments that mattered. The snow was already ankle-deep on the path, and his Italian leather shoes were wholly inadequate for the conditions. Jerome was calculating whether he should turn back when he heard it, a sound so fragile it almost disappeared into the wind. "Sir." He stopped, convinced he'd imagined it. The voice came again, stronger this time, edged with desperation that cut through his executive numbness. "Sir, please, my baby brother is freezing." Jerome turned toward the sound, his executive instincts warring with the part of him that had learned to tune out the city's endless requests for attention. Through the swirling snow, he could barely make out a small figure hunched on a park bench about 20 feet away. The figure moved, and he saw it was a child, maybe 7 or 8 years old, wrapped in what looked like a thin denim jacket wholly insufficient for the temperature that had dropped to the teens. He walked closer, each step crunching through snow that had already begun to freeze into a crystalline crust. The girl's face was turned up toward him, tear tracks frozen on her cheeks that caught the glow from the distant Christmas lights. Her lips had a bluish tint that Jerome recognized from a corporate ski trip years ago, when one of his executives had nearly gotten frostbite. But it wasn't her condition that made his breath catch. It was the bundle she held against her chest, wrapped in what appeared to be a ragged blanket. The bundle moved, and a thin, weak cry emerged from it. Not the robust wail of a healthy infant, but something diminished and fading, like a smoke alarm running out of battery. Jerome dropped to one knee in front of the bench, his expensive pants soaking through immediately. "Where are your parents?" The question came out sharper than he intended, honed by too many years of demanding answers in boardrooms. The girl flinched, clutching the baby tighter. "Mama said she'd be right back. She said to wait here and keep Braden warm." Her voice was small but steady, a child trying desperately to be brave. But that was, I don't know how long. It was still light out. Jerome glanced at his watch. Past 1 in the morning. If she'd been here since dusk, that meant 5 hours, maybe 6. He looked at the baby again. This bundle the girl called Braden. The infant's face was pale, almost gray, and his lips matched his sister's blue tint. The weak cries had stopped entirely now, and Jerome knew with the certainty that had made him millions that this wasn't sleep. This was a body beginning to shut down. "What's your name?" he asked, forcing his voice softer. "Stephanie. Stephanie Brooks." She looked at him with eyes that held far too much understanding for someone her age. "Is Braden going to die?" The question hung in the frozen air between them, more honest than any business negotiation Jerome had ever navigated. He could walk away, call 911 from a distance, let the professionals handle it, arrive at his penthouse in time for a hot shower and 4 hours of sleep before his 7 a.m. strategy session. That would be the sensible choice, the choice that didn't complicate his carefully constructed life. But Braden's stillness was answer enough to Stephanie's question. and Jerome Morgan discovered that some decisions bypass the brain entirely and go straight to a place he'd thought he'd buried years ago. Jerome was already shrugging out of his overcoat before conscious thought caught up with instinct. The charcoal wool and cashmere blend had cost him $3,000 at a Milan boutique, tailored to his exact measurements. He'd worn it to close the Henderson deal, to his father's funeral, to every significant moment of the past 2 years. None of that mattered now. "Come here," he said, his voice stripped of its boardroom authority and reduced to something more human. He wrapped the coat around both children, pulling Stephanie up from the bench as he bundled Braden against her chest. The girl was lighter than he expected, hollow-boned like a bird, and she stumbled when she tried to stand. Her legs had gone numb from hours of sitting in the cold. Jerome didn't hesitate. He scooped both of them up, coat and all, cradling them against his chest the way he used to carry his daughter when she'd fall asleep during car rides. Stephanie made a small sound of protest, that instinctive stranger danger warning that good parents drilled into their children, but she was too cold and too exhausted to fight. Her head dropped against his shoulder, and through his suit jacket he could feel how violently she was shivering. The wind hit him immediately, cutting through his suit like it was tissue paper. The cold was shocking, intimate, aggressive in a way he hadn't experienced since his college years when he'd been too poor to afford proper winter gear. His teeth began to chatter within seconds. His ears burned. But he'd run cross-country in college, and his body remembered how to push through discomfort toward a finish line. His building was 12 blocks away, but he knew a shortcut through the shopping district that would cut it down to 8, maybe 9 if the snow slowed him down. Jerome started walking, then jogging, his Italian leather shoes sliding on the icy pavement. Each breath felt like inhaling razors. His fingers were already losing sensation where they gripped the children, and he had to focus on maintaining his hold as feeling drained away. Stephanie stirred against him. "Mama said never go with strangers." "Your mama was right," Jerome managed through chattering teeth. "But she also taught you to save your brother, didn't she? That's what you're doing right now." He could feel Braden's stillness through the layers of coat and blanket, could feel how the infant's body temperature was stealing what little warmth remained. It was a race now, pure mathematics stripped of sentiment. Body heat, distance, time. Variables that would determine whether he reached his building with 2 living children or something else entirely. The Christmas lights blurred past as he ran, his lungs screaming, his body temperature dropping with each passing minute. Somewhere in the back of his mind, the executive in him calculated the odds. But the man who had once been a father kept running anyway, gambling everything on an outcome he couldn't control. The lobby doorman's eyes went wide when Jerome burst through the revolving doors, clutching 2 children and coatless in the middle of a blizzard. Marcus had worked the night shift for 3 years and had seen Jerome return from late meetings hundreds of times, always composed, always untouchable. "Not like this. Never like this." "Called Dr. Reeves," Jerome gasped, already moving toward the elevator. "Tell him it's life or death. I don't care if he's asleep. Get him here now." The elevator ride to the 42nd floor took 38 seconds that felt like hours. Jerome watched the numbers climb while trying to assess Braden through touch alone. The baby wasn't crying anymore, wasn't moving. His tiny chest rose and fell in shallow movements that seemed too far apart, too weak. Inside the penthouse, Jerome's carefully curated space transformed into controlled chaos. He laid both children on the leather sofa in his living room, unwrapping them from his coat with hands that fumbled from cold and adrenaline. Stephanie was shivering so hard her teeth rattled, but she was conscious and responsive. Braden was another matter entirely. The infant's skin had gone from pale to an alarming grayish-blue. His lips were purple. When Jerome touched the baby's cheek, the skin felt wrong, cold and waxy like something that had been refrigerated. He grabbed throw blankets from his bedroom, piling them on both children, then cranked his thermostat to 85 degrees. Dr. Marcus Reeves arrived 14 minutes later, his salt and pepper hair disheveled and his medical bag clutched in one hand. He'd been Jerome's concierge physician for 5 years, treating everything from stress-induced migraines to a nasty bout of flu. He took one look at the scene, and his bedside manner evaporated into pure clinical focus. How long were they outside? He was already examining Braden, pressing a stethoscope to the infant's tiny chest. 5 hours, maybe 6. The girl said it was still light when they were left. Reeves's jaw tightened. He pulled out a thermometer, checked Braden's core temperature, and swore under his breath. 89 degrees. We're looking at severe hypothermia. I need towels, warm water, not hot. And call 911. He needs a hospital. But even as Jerome moved to comply, Reeves was working. He stripped away Braden's wet clothing, his movements quick and practiced. He wrapped the infant in dry blankets, then held him against his own chest, using his body heat as a gradual warming mechanism. He checked the baby's breathing, his pulse, his responsiveness with an intensity that made Jerome's quarterly earnings calls look like casual conversation. "Come on, little man," Reeves murmured, rubbing the infant's limbs to stimulate circulation. "Stay with me. Come on." Stephanie watched from the couch, her eyes huge and terrified. Jerome sat beside her, one arm around her thin shoulders, and realized he was praying for the first time in years. Praying to a God he'd stopped believing in somewhere between his MBA and his first million. Praying for a baby he'd known for less than an hour, but couldn't imagine losing. Detective Sarah Chun arrived at 3:15 in the morning, her shield clipped to her belt and exhaustion written across her face in ways that suggested this was just another call in a very long shift. She looked at the scene in Jerome's penthouse, at the CEO in a soaked designer suit hovering over 2 children who clearly didn't belong in this world of marble countertops and abstract art, and something shifted in her expression. "Mr. Morgan?" She pulled out a notebook, her voice professionally neutral. "I need to ask you some questions about how you came into contact with these children." Jerome explained while Dr. Reeves continued working on Braden, whose color had improved from gray to a slightly less alarming pale pink. The infant's temperature had climbed to 92 degrees, still dangerously low but trending in the right direction. Chin listened, taking notes, occasionally glancing at Stephanie, who sat wrapped in blankets and trembling despite the overheated room. "We picked up their mother an hour ago," Chin said, closing her notebook. "Christina Brooks. She was found unconscious in a shooting gallery 6 blocks from where you found the children. Heroin overdose. She's alive, stable at Metro General, but she's going to face charges." The words hung in the air like smoke. Jerome watched Stephanie's face crumple, watched this child who had been so brave for so long finally break under the weight of a truth she'd probably known all along. Her mother hadn't been coming back. Her mother had chosen the drugs over them. "Stephanie," Chin said, crouching down to the girl's eye level with a gentleness that suggested she'd delivered this kind of news before. "Can you tell me what happened tonight? When did your mama leave you?" Stephanie's voice came out small and fractured. "After it got dark. We were at Aunt Kelly's, but Aunt Kelly said Mama owed her money and we had to leave. Mama said she knew someone who could help, and we walked to the park. She told me to wait on the bench and keep Braden warm. She said she'd be back in 10 minutes. "And how long did you wait?" "I don't know. A long time. The Christmas lights came on. People walked by, but they didn't look at us. I tried to keep Braden warm like Mama said, but he kept crying, and then he stopped crying, and I got scared." Tears tracked down her face, and she wiped them away with the back of her hand. "I know I'm not supposed to talk to strangers, but Braden was so cold and I didn't know what to do. I thought maybe Mama would be mad, but I thought Braden was dying." Jerome felt something crack open in his chest, some calcified place that had been sealed since his divorce. This child had made an impossible choice in the dark, had broken the rules to save her brother's life, had carried a burden no 7-year-old should have to bear. Chun was writing again, her pen moving across the page with mechanical efficiency. "The children will need to be placed in emergency foster care tonight. I'll need to contact child services." "No." The word came out of Jerome before he'd fully formed the thought. Detective Chun looked up from her notebook, one eyebrow raised in a way that suggested she'd heard every variation of objection from well-meaning civilians who thought good intentions could override protocol. "Mr. Morgan, I understand you want to help, but there are procedures. These children need to be placed with vetted foster families." The system exists for their protection. The system wants to separate them. Jerome stood, his voice taking on the edge he used in negotiations when the other side thought they held leverage. Stephanie and Braden. You're going to put them in different emergency placements because there aren't enough homes that can take siblings together, especially not an infant who just survived hypothermia. Chen's expression flickered with something that might have been respect or might have been annoyance. That's not my call to make. Then get someone on the phone who can make that call. Jerome pulled out his phone, already scrolling through contacts. I want these children to stay here tonight. Tomorrow we can sort out the long-term arrangements. But right now, Braden is stable but critical, and Stephanie has been through enough trauma without being dragged to a stranger's house at 4 in the morning. You're not a licensed foster parent. You haven't been background checked. For all I know, you could be. I'm the CEO of Morgan Technologies. Google me. My background check is public record because I sit on 3 corporate boards and 2 nonprofit foundations. I've been fingerprinted by the SEC, vetted by shareholders, and investigated by journalists looking for dirt they never. Stephanie watched from the couch, her eyes huge and terrified. Jerome sat beside her, one arm around her thin shoulders, and realized he was praying for the first time in years. Praying to a God he'd stopped believing in somewhere between his MBA and his first million. Praying for a baby he'd known for less than an hour but couldn't imagine losing. Child Services granted Jerome temporary emergency custody with conditions that arrived via email at 6:30 that morning. Daily check-ins, a home study within 72 hours, and Dr. Reeves's continued medical supervision of Braden. Jerome read the terms on his phone while simultaneously trying to figure out how to properly fasten a diaper on an infant who seemed determined to kick his way free. The tabs go in the front, Stephanie said from where she sat cross-legged on the guest bed, watching him with the weary patience of someone who'd changed more diapers than any 7-year-old should have to. And you have to make sure his thing is pointing down or he'll leak everywhere. Jerome adjusted accordingly, feeling heat creep up his neck. He negotiated billion-dollar mergers with heads of state, but a 9-pound infant had reduced him to incompetence. When he'd raised his own daughter, his ex-wife had handled most of the infant care, while he built the company that would eventually cost him his marriage. Now karma was presenting him with a remedial course in basic parenting, and he was failing spectacularly. Braden's temperature had stabilized at 98 degrees, and the grayish pallor had given way to healthy pink skin. But the infant was fussy, probably from the trauma his small body had endured, and he cried with intensity that seemed impossible for something so tiny. Jerome walked the length of his penthouse at 2 in the afternoon, bouncing Braden gently and humming tuneless melodies while his assistant rescheduled 3 meetings and a conference call with Tokyo. You have to support his head more, Stephanie advised, appearing at his elbow like a tiny consultant. And he likes it when you pat his back, not rub. Jerome adjusted his hold, marveling at how something so fragile had survived 6 hours in sub-freezing temperatures. Life, he was learning, was both more resilient and more precious than any quarterly earnings report had taught him. One wrong move, one moment of inattention, and this small creature could be hurt in ways that no amount of money could fix. The night terrors started after midnight. Jerome woke to screaming from the guest room where Stephanie slept, a sound of pure terror that had him running before he was fully conscious. He found her tangled in sheets, thrashing and crying, her eyes open but unseeing. Stephanie, you're safe. You're in my apartment. You're safe. He kept his voice low and steady, the way he'd once talked his daughter through nightmares about monsters under the bed. But Stephanie's monsters were real, and they wore the face of abandonment. Mama left us, she sobbed when she finally woke, her small body shaking. She said 10 minutes, but she didn't come back, and Braden was so cold, and I thought he was dead in. Jerome pulled her into his arms, this child who'd been forced to be an adult in the worst possible way. I know, but you saved him. You were so brave, and you saved your brother's life. She cried against his shoulder while he held her, and Jerome understood with sudden clarity that this was what he'd been missing in his temperature-controlled existence. Not comfort, but the raw, messy reality of being needed by someone who had nothing left but trust. 3 days into their temporary arrangement, Jerome found Stephanie sitting at his kitchen island, drawing elaborate pictures with the art supplies his assistant had delivered along with clothes, diapers, and every childcare item the internet suggested might be necessary. She was sketching the park bench with surprising detail, the Christmas lights rendered in careful loops of color, a small figure holding a bundle. "That's a beautiful drawing," Jerome said, setting down a plate of scrambled eggs that he'd only slightly burned. Cooking was another skill he was relearning from scratch. Stephanie didn't look up. Ms. Martinez from Child Services said I should draw what happened. She said it helps to get feelings out. Jerome had met Ms. Martinez during yesterday's home visit, a woman with kind eyes and a clipboard who'd asked questions that felt like landmines. Was he prepared for the long-term commitment? Did he understand the trauma these children carried? Could a single man with a demanding career really provide the stability they needed? He'd answered with the same confidence he brought to investor meetings, but later, alone, he'd wondered if confidence was enough when the stakes were 2 lives instead of market share. "Stephanie, can I ask you something?" Jerome sat down across from her, watching as she added more detail to the sketch. "That night in the park, when you asked me for help, do you remember what your mama taught you about strangers?" Her hand stilled on the crayon. "Never talk to strangers. Never go anywhere with them. Never get in their cars." She recited it like a catechism, something drilled into her through repetition. "Those are good rules," Jerome said carefully. "Important rules. And you know what? You were incredibly smart and brave for breaking them." Stephanie's head jerked up, confusion written across her features. "But Mama said." "Your mama was right to teach you those rules. They keep you safe most of the time." Jerome leaned forward, holding her gaze. "But you knew something more important. You knew your brother was dying, and you knew that following the rules would mean losing him. So you made a choice that most adults couldn't make. You asked for help even though you were scared." Tears welled in her eyes. "I thought Mama would be mad. I thought maybe I did something wrong. You did everything right." Jerome reached across the table, covering her small hand with his. "The hardest part of being brave isn't knowing when to follow the rules. It's knowing when breaking them is the only way to save someone you love. You understood that when you were 7 years old, sitting in the freezing dark. That makes you one of the bravest people I've ever met." Stephanie was quiet for a long moment, processing this permission to have done something that contradicted everything she'd been taught. "Mr. Jerome? Just Jerome is fine. Are you glad I talked to you? Even though you were a stranger." Jerome thought about his empty penthouse, his hollow achievements, the way his life had felt like an expensive museum where he was the only exhibit. Then he thought about Braden's laugh this morning when Jerome had made faces during a diaper change, about Stephanie's small hand in his during her nightmares, about how his apartment now smelled like baby powder and felt like something that might eventually become a home. "Stephanie, talking to me that night was the best decision either of us ever made." The family courtroom was nothing like the boardrooms where Jerome had spent the last 15 years of his life. There was no polished mahogany, no panoramic views of the city, no implicit understanding that his presence commanded respect. Judge Catherine Walsh presided from the bench with a weathered expression of someone who'd seen every variation of human failure parade through her courtroom. As she looked at Jerome with a skepticism reserved for wealthy men who thought money could solve problems that required something more fundamental. The petition for permanent custody sat before her, alongside reports from Ms. Martinez, Dr. Reeves, and Detective Chun. Jerome's lawyer, a family law specialist who'd come highly recommended, had advised him to let the documentation speak for itself. But when Judge Walsh asked if he had anything to add, Jerome stood. "Your Honor, I'd like to address the court directly." His lawyer's eyes widened in alarm, but Jerome was already moving forward. He'd built a company by knowing when to follow counsel and when to trust his instincts. This was a moment for instinct. 3 months ago, I was walking home through a snowstorm, thinking about quarterly projections and market share. My biggest concern was whether we'd beat analyst expectations. Jerome's voice carried the authority of 1,000 presentations. but stripped of its corporate polish. I had everything I thought I wanted: success, respect, financial security. And I was completely empty. Judge Walsh's expression didn't change, but she leaned forward slightly. Then I heard a voice. A 7-year-old girl asking me to save her baby brother, who was freezing to death. And in that moment, I had a choice. I could call 911 and walk away, let the system handle it. That would have been the sensible thing, the safe thing. Or I could give them my coat and carry them home, knowing that decision would change everything. Jerome glanced back at Stephanie, sitting between Ms. Martinez and his lawyer, her hair in careful braids and her eyes fixed on him with an intensity that made his chest ache. People keep asking if I'm prepared for the responsibility of raising 2 traumatized children, if I understand what I'm taking on, if I can really provide what they need. He turned back to Judge Walsh. The truth is, I'm not sure I can give them everything they deserve. I work too many hours. I'm still learning how to make breakfast without setting off the smoke alarm. I don't know all the words to the lullabies Stephanie remembers from before her mother's addiction destroyed their family. The courtroom was silent except for the hum of fluorescent lights overhead. But here's what I do know. Stephanie has nightmares, and I hold her until she falls back asleep. Braden smiles when I make silly faces during diaper changes. They've turned my empty penthouse into a home with Lego bricks on the floor and fingerprints on the windows. They've given me a reason to leave work before midnight and a reason to believe that success isn't measured in stock prices. Jerome's voice dropped, became something rawer and more honest than any earnings call he'd ever delivered. Your Honor, everyone keeps asking if I can take care of these children. But the real question is whether I can survive without them. Because they didn't just need saving that night. I did too. 2 years later, Jerome stood in the same family courtroom, but everything had changed. Judge Walsh was still presiding, her hair perhaps a bit grayer, her expression still measuring him with the careful assessment of someone who'd learned that good intentions didn't always translate to good outcomes. But this time, Stephanie sat beside him at the petitioner's table, 9 years old now and wearing a blue dress she'd picked out herself. Braden, nearly 3, was on Jerome's lap, contentedly playing with a toy truck and occasionally smashing it against the table with the destructive enthusiasm of toddlers everywhere. Mr. Morgan, Judge Walsh began, shuffling through papers that represented 24 months of home visits, psychological evaluations, parenting classes, and supervised interactions. The court has reviewed the reports from Child Services, and I must say, the progress documented here is remarkable. Jerome felt Stephanie's hand slip into his free one, her fingers no longer quite so small, her grip steady and sure. The night terrors had diminished over the past year, replaced by dreams she actually wanted to share at breakfast. She'd made friends at the private school Jerome had enrolled her in, had discovered a talent for art that her teachers said was exceptional for her age. More importantly, she'd learned to laugh again, to trust that the adults in her life wouldn't disappear when she needed them most. Braden's developmental assessments show he's meeting all his milestones, the judge continued, and the toddler in question chose that moment to drop his truck, which clattered across the courtroom floor. Jerome bent to retrieve it, the movement so automatic now that he didn't even think about it. This was fatherhood, the mundane reality of dropped toys and scraped knees and endless questions about why the sky was blue and where did the moon go during the day. And Ms. Martinez's report indicates that you've successfully maintained a work-life balance that prioritizes the children's needs while continuing to run your company. Balance was perhaps generous. Jerome had stepped back from day-to-day operations, promoted his COO to CEO, and taken the role of chairman where he could set his own schedule. Morgan Technologies was thriving under new leadership, and Jerome had discovered that the company he'd built didn't actually need him nearly as much as 2 children did. His net worth had remained essentially unchanged, but his life had become immeasurably richer in ways that quarterly reports could never capture. Judge Walsh looked at him over her reading glasses, and something that might have been approval flickered across her features. Mr. Morgan, the court is prepared to finalize the adoption of Stephanie Brooks and Braden Egan. Do you understand that this is a permanent, irrevocable decision? That these children will legally become your son and daughter with all the rights and responsibilities that entails? Jerome looked at Stephanie, who was watching him with eyes that had seen too much darkness but had somehow found their way back to hope. He looked at Braden, who had no memory of that frozen night, but carried Jerome's last name on every school form and medical record. He thought about his penthouse, no longer a showroom, but a home with finger paintings on the refrigerator and a blanket fort in the living room that he kept promising to dismantle, but never quite did. "Your Honor," Jerome said, his voice carrying the same certainty he'd once reserved for billion-dollar decisions, "I've never been more sure of anything in my life." Judge Walsh signed the papers with decisive strokes, and just like that, Jerome Morgan became a father again.
Thank you for watching this story to the end. If you enjoyed this story, you will surely love the next one. It's crazier and more intriguing than you can ever imagine. So do well to check it out. Click on the link on your screen to subscribe now.